Good morning, everybody. Well, Stephen's already thanked you, but I can't help but thank you again for all that you've done and all that you continue to do in supporting us. And just to spin that, there we go. Try not to cause an accident within the first 2 minutes at least. But as Stephen says, what you give, not only in your finance, but in your prayers, and you've supported me through a health journey and chronic illness for 17 years. So thank you for that, and thank you for your prayers and your care, and messages at Christmas and different things. We just appreciate you so much. Within the next few weeks, we'll be in Czech Republic doing a conference on prayer. Stephen's then got his trip to the Balkans. He's taking the Missio Dei students out. And then we're even getting back to South Africa this summer as well, which we are so excited about. We are going to hopefully have a bit of holiday in there as well. But we've also got a couple of weeks of ministry in different places around the country. So there's lots of different things going on. It's really exciting. So last year when I spoke here, I spoke on changing your metrics and of looking more Christ-like. And over the past few weeks, you've been talking about the crowd and some of these wonderful Bible stories. There's all kinds of things going on. You've got your key characters, the people we know, but you've also got your crowd as well. And so I'm hopefully going to bring actually a little bit of both of those together. And I want you to think as well today about you and the crowd. It's entirely possible I'll overlap with some of the things you've heard in the last few weeks, but I don't mind about that at all. You can take it as some reinforcement for something else. We hear good things about crowds. I'm just going to mention that now because I'm going to bring a lot of challenge about crowds. But just to say there can be really good things about crowds. We look forward to the great promise of Revelation 7:9 and the great crowd of witnesses that will be there. We think also about Pentecost and times when there was great crowds that heard the word of God and came to know Jesus. I've even seen some good things about there was somebody trapped on a tube train and a whole crowd of people came along and pushed that tube to one side so that person could come out. So there can be good things about crowds, but there can be challenges with crowds as well. You got great. Yeah, that's a great fan. We'll talk about your fan later anyway. Jesus journeyed with different people in different ways, and we see a lot of crowds. We see a lot of crowds that follow Jesus, but we also see him working with his disciples. And really what today is going to be talking about is the difference between being a disciple and being part of the crowd. And even within the disciples, you have your 1, your 3, your 12, your 72, all the other groups that follow, and then the crowds as well. And it always seems a bit strange to us that because especially here, we think of any time that there's any form of election, if you select somebody for something, that's a form of favoritism. It's a form of saying, I like these people, I don't like the rest of them. But it isn't like that with Jesus. He has a strategy, he has a plan. He knows exactly where each one of us fits into that plan. And he picked people that I probably wouldn't have picked. If you think about the 3 that he had, Peter, James, and John, you've got Peter there, who is a loud mouth, who's not afraid to say something, however idiotic it might be in that particular moment. You get the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, who were there as well, whose first thing, as soon as Jesus mentions something about later, they're like, who's the greatest? Who's going to be the one that gets everything? It's not maybe who we'd pick, is it? But that's who Jesus journeyed with closest. So I want to give you 4 points this morning about the difference between being a disciple and being part of the crowd. And the first one is this: it's sacrificial versus superficial. And for this one, I'm going to read, you probably heard this last week or the week before, but we're going to read from John 12 and verses 12 to 19. And it says this: the next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey, etc., etc. At first, his disciples did not understand all this. Now, the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. And now the whole world has gone after him. This is our Palm Sunday crowd. And as Lucy was telling me yesterday, she was getting very excited. She'd seen something great in it. You've got two different crowds coming together. The crowd that have come for the festival, that are celebrating the memories of the past. And then you've got the crowd that's there because of what Jesus has done in that moment. But do you know what all the crowds are there for? They're there to be entertained. They're there because there's something going on and they want to be part of that. There's a great big party going on in Jerusalem at this time. They want to be part of this party. So whether they've come for the festival or whether they've come because they've heard of what Jesus did for Lazarus and they want to be part of they want to know what's going on. They don't want to miss this story. They don't want to miss this narrative. But there is an element of entertainment. What's going on? It's a bit superficial. It's a little bit shallow. It's not really people that have necessarily journeyed with Jesus the whole time, but they're there because there's something going on and they want to be part of that. Do you know what entertainment is? It's about me. It's about what do I get out of this? What can I have from this moment? And I want us to challenge and kind of taking it from the Bible story to us here today is to say a little bit of what you believe, your basic foundation beliefs about what is the gospel, what is the good news of the kingdom. That affects whether you are part of the crowd today or whether you are a disciple. Are you here for a bit of entertainment? Are you here superficially? But it's not really sacrificial. It's not really a whole lifestyle. This is your Sunday morning. We tick this off. I've done this. But it's not my whole life. And there's a risk when we talk just about decisions for Jesus. And we're penties, right? And I'm a total penty. Okay, so I get this. But we get very excited about the decisions. And we should. We should rejoice and celebrate every time. So please, I'm not taking that away from you whatsoever. But when we make it just about the decision, when we just, get your ticket to heaven, Jesus is going to help you, it's great. There's no more carrying your cross afterwards. There's no more having to live your life for him. Then we completely change the gospel. We make it from something that's a deep, meaningful relationship, that's sacrifice and cost and carrying a cross. And we take it away from that. And instead we're just like, oh, come and join us. Jesus will help you. God bless you. I've got a couple of quotes for you here. I'm convinced that by reducing the complete gospel story of God's work from Genesis to Revelation to a package 3 or 4 points with a prayer, we've diminished our understanding of salvation and what it means to be a follower of Christ. This shift from gospel culture to salvation culture has weakened the church, diminished the lives of Christians, and made disciple-making difficult. What we should see as the starting line, our conversion to Christ, has become the finish line. And just think about that. We think, now, last time when I was here, I talked about justification and sanctification. So yes, when you have got across that line, in one sense, yes, it is done. You are already there. You are already justified. You are already as close to God as you ever need to be. You can never be more loved than you are right now, whether you've made that decision or not. You are already perfectly loved. But Jesus doesn't call us to just step across the line. He calls us to live a life alongside him, a life of sacrifice, which isn't a popular message always, but it isn't a life where you just live for yourself and it's just about, I've got my golden ticket to heaven. Bill Hull says this, the weakness of the gospel of just forgiveness only is in what it doesn't mention. Everything that we've said is true. We're not taking anything away from that message of forgiveness, of salvation, of glorification, of getting into heaven. That's all true. But what we do is if we don't mention the discipleship bit, if we don't mention the living, it's the gospel of sin management. You manage your sin rather than having a life transformed. He described it as, I don't know what you'll think to this term, he describes it as fostering vampire Christians. He says you want a little bit of blood and then nothing else. You've got your state, you've got your life in heaven sorted. You've got your confidence in heaven, but you've got no stake and no reason to live for Christ now. And if we think about that crowd that we read about on Palm Sunday, those two different crowds coming together, whether they're celebrating the past or the present, They're all there for that entertainment, for that shallowness, for the what's next? What about me? What about my entertainment? But, it was quite different for the disciples. If you think about what the disciples saw that week, and that week, an awful lot of the Gospels is about the following week and what the disciples went through. And as Jesus went into the temple and threw over all the tables, and Jesus is teaching them. You've got the Passover meal that week and different things going on. And, they lived a very different life to the crowds. They lived with Jesus. They heard every detail. We can go to big concerts or big stadiums for sports events. For me, it'd probably be more likely the stadium. I've been to see Beyonce and been to see Evanescence and some of these big bands. And I go there to be entertained. Yeah. Now, other people, Stephen is not, he has actually been to those as well. I did drag him along to see Beyonce. Yeah, I've just, ruined your reputation there, Stephen. But for him, it'd be more about the big stadiums. It's going to be about the rugby grounds and the football stadiums, But what you can do is you've got a choice, haven't you? You can go and you can watch, which is what we do. Or you can go and watch and you can be inspired and want to start to imitate and to change. And being part of that, you can think, well, you know what? I'm going to change the way that I eat. I'm going to change the way that I exercise. I'm going to practice. I'm going to change and I'm going to try and imitate these people that I'm admiring so that I can have a little bit of that life for me, and it's not just about entertainment. For the disciples, they had this whole culture shock going on constantly with Jesus. I think we're very harsh on the disciples. The fact is Jesus came in and he absolutely messed up their worldview. Everything that they had always understood and believed, and they just accepted it like all of us do. Everything that you hear all the time, you just accept it. This is how it is, whether it's on the news or what you read online. This is the world. And Jesus came in and he kept breaking barriers. He sat there and spoke to that Samaritan woman. You know what? She's a woman. He's a man. She's a Samaritan. He's a Jew. She's an outcast from her community. He's a rabbi. And he's there, and his disciples are very, very uncomfortable all the time. Whatever Jesus is doing, the disciples are so uncomfortable. You have that whole thing, the story that we really don't like to talk about because we don't understand it, where you have Jesus describing the Gentiles as dogs. And you're like, what's that about? And you forget he's not just speaking to the lady, he's speaking to the disciples, and he's teaching all of them around, and he's challenging their prejudice, and he's saying what they're thinking, and he's teaching them something new. The disciples are going through this journey, but the crowds aren't. The crowds are just there for the show. They're there for the big glory moments. They're not there for the day in, day out. What does it look like to be Jesus? My second point today is about relationship versus reward. Relationship versus reward. I'm going to read now from Matthew chapter 4 and verses 21 to 25. I might just read part of it, actually. Jesus went through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and illness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. What did they follow him for? They wanted something out of him. They wanted reward. The crowd was there because they wanted what he could give them, what he could do for them. They weren't there for a relationship with him. They were there for the reward. It's very easy to confuse the two sometimes, isn't it? Because we're here because we want peace in our lives. We want Jesus' joy in our lives. We want his presence with us. We want all the good things that he does for us. But are we also wanting the relationship? Are we also wanting that daily deep interaction? Are we wanting to get to know him better so that it's not only that he gives us great rewards, but he is our great reward? We need that relationship. Peterson, who translated the Bible into the Message version, said this: "The ways of Jesus goes about loving and saving the world are personal. There's nothing disembodied or abstract. It's all incarnate. It's flesh and blood. But a lot of the programs that we have in the West are depersonalized. Their structure, their system, their organization, their techniques, instead of relationship. You know, and we can get different kind of gospels, so bringing it into some of the things that we can think of today that determine whether we're part of the crowd or determine whether we're a disciple. You see, I could mention a couple of different styles of gospel that you will have heard different people believe, but most of the time they don't come with the title. It's below that. I might say to you prosperity gospel or consumer gospel, and you'll be like, oh no, that's not me. But actually sometimes when we pray, and the thing is this, is God is here to give us abundant life. God is here to give us great reward, wonderful, wonderful things. But it's when we start to take that to a point of entitlement, when we start to take that to a point of believing that God is subject to my manipulation. God owes me. I heard a young man even this week, and he could not get over how unfair the gospel was. And his point is some people, like the guy on the cross next to Jesus, all he had to do is just say it there and then he went straight to heaven. And this poor lad, he has to live a life following God's rules. It's not fair. I'm genuine, aren't I, Steve? We heard that this week. And I'll tell you this, the gospel is unfair. It is the most unfair thing ever because you don't deserve it. None of us deserve it. I don't deserve it. None of us deserve it. But as soon as we start thinking it's all about me and it's about what I can get out of God, it's what I can get out of this, that it's a problem. You know, and as well with that kind of whole idea of the consumer gospel, you know, this is a kind of person who's, well, I'll go to this church if it meets my needs. If I get out of the worship what I want to get out of the worship. And if I don't, I'm going to go to the church down the road instead because they'll suit me far better. There's no depth, there's no relationship. Worship isn't about what you get out of it. Worship is about what you put into it. You know, you shouldn't ever have to worry about that. It's about Jesus. You cannot flourish if you've been trained to measure your spirituality by what you think of the worship service. God does meet your needs, but the crowd is only there to get their needs met. The disciples, they're with Jesus for the relationship instead. The next one I want to say is that anonymous versus adopted. And if we think of crowds, I think you can see quite easily that it's very easy to be anonymous in a crowd. It's very easy to get lost in a crowd. And thinking even about Hope for Justice, how many people are lost and feeling very anonymous and very irrelevant and very unseen in our world. And we can all feel that as well. I looked up at your ceiling earlier. Now, I don't know, because I wasn't watching you, whether anybody else in the room. Did anybody look up at the ceiling? Yeah? Yeah. It doesn't actually take many people to change the behavior of a crowd because we follow. Now, obviously, I'm at the front, so it's maybe a little bit more obvious. But they actually say it only takes 5% of a group to do something to affect the other 95%. And just somebody doing something, everybody else wants to follow the crowd, don't they? When you have the crowd, my mum, we lived in Wolverhampton before I moved to Rotherham. And we weren't allowed, was in the 80s, so there was a real time of kind of, you know, football mobs and hooliganism and different things. I wasn't allowed out on a Saturday into town because there was a lot of problems when the football was on with that mob mentality. And sometimes the group identity completely overrides the identity of individuals. You know, we see that in person with riots. We see what's going on in France at the moment. People doing things that they wouldn't do if they were on their own. But in a crowd, they've lost their individual identity, so they just go along with that. They're anonymous in that moment. They start to conform, and they sacrifice their own interests for the interests of the group. You know, they did some experiments a few years ago where they would say, right, we're just going to test you. And they probably told them it was about logic and information. And they'd show them some different lines and try to guess which line is the same as the other lines. Caitlin's looking at me. She must have studied this in psychology, I think, last week, apparently. Okay, I didn't know that, but they did it. And what they would do is they would prime the first few people who would give a public answer to give a wrong answer. And it was quite obvious, the line, which one they should say, it was quite obvious. But if you're there in a group of, let's say, 10 people, and the first 9 have all said, yeah, the answer is clearly A. And you're there, I'm sure it's C. I really think it. But you presume that the crowd has got some information that you don't have. So a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people would then conform their answer. Even though they know that it's wrong, they will go with the rest of the group. You know, there's an example as well. Imagine if 2 new restaurants set up next to each other. Brand new, similar kind of decor, similar kind of food. There's no reviews or anything yet. The first person who comes along, they're looking at the both. It might be the smallest thing that makes the difference, whether they go to the left or right. But they go in and they sit down. Second person comes along. They're no longer just basing it on what they say. They're now basing it on the fact that there's somebody sat in this one. They go and sit in it. Third person comes along. There's 2 people in there. Let's go to that. And before you know it, these 2 almost identical restaurants, one is full and one is empty because everybody assumes the crowd must have the answer. The crowd doesn't always have the answer. We all bought toilet rolls during COVID because the crowd has the answer. So bringing it to today and the gospel, actually let me just read you a passage first. Let's go to Mark 5, verses 24 to 34, about a woman who's very anonymous. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, that's Jesus. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. I will skip some verses just for time. She'd suffered a great deal. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I touch his cloak, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him and asked the crowd, who touched my clothes? The disciples respond, you see the people crowding around you and yet you say, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened, came and fell down and told him. You see, she was anonymous in that crowd. The crowd didn't see her. The crowd knew nothing about her. They didn't know the suffering that she was going through in that minute. The disciples didn't even know, but Jesus knew. You know, and there's nobody invisible in this room this morning. But sometimes in that, you just get swayed by the crowd. And you know, in terms of thinking about the gospel today and what it is that you might believe that makes you part of the crowd or makes you a disciple, well, it might be a bit of compromise with the gospel. Let's just take this bit of the gospel out. Let's syncretize it a little bit. Let's make the gospel a little bit more appealing to the current culture and the current society. Because that's good, isn't it? Because if we can make the gospel more appealing to all the people, then we'll get more people making decisions, won't we? And sometimes we can start to pander to the crowd and pander to what's around us because that makes it easier if we can just go with the crowd. The disciples couldn't just go with the crowd. The fourth one that I want to say is this: worth versus works. Worth versus works. We'll actually go straight to our Bible reading for this one. This is John 7 and verses 11 to 13. It's a very short one, this. Now, at the festival, the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, where is he? Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. And some said, he's a good man. Others replied, no, he deceives people. But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders. You know, sometimes in a crowd, you want to win the approval of the crowd. You want to look right in front of that crowd. I don't know if anybody's noticed nowadays, but in today's culture, you can have a situation where somebody is the best thing ever. And then a few weeks later, they say something, they send out a tweet, and all of a sudden, we're done with you. We're done. It's quite funny, one of the comedians was saying that they had a particular show where they made a particular joke, and they always knew when that joke had been on, that particular show had been on rerun on one of the channels, Dave or whatever, because every time this joke was shown again, they would get recancelled. Every time it happened, they'd suddenly get all these tweets telling them what they thought about them. You know, and so sometimes is we want to behave so that we get the approval of the crowd. That was the challenge for many of the people in first century Judaism, and it is the challenge for each one of us today. You know, sometimes you can get churches that force you to such a strict moral code. You must wear this, you must do this, you must behave like this, that it starts to go from being a gospel of grace to actually, it's all about your behavior. Now, I'm telling you, to be a disciple, we want you to behave in a certain way in line with what Jesus says. But when it all becomes about what you look like, how you appear, how you do things. You know, one of my friends is American, and she came from quite a right-wing church. And she had a friend who was raped as a teenager. And this girl got all the blame. Because in that moral community, it wasn't okay for her to be pregnant at that age. And there was no kindness, there was no grace, there was no compassion. Everything was about appealing instead to the crowd. And actually, if you've got that where you're like, I'm the best, I've got it, I'm conforming to this, then what we do is we take on that gospel of works instead, and we have that theological swagger. I'm right, and the rest of you are wrong. You know, Jesus was right, the disciples were right, but look at the grace, look at the compassion with which he looked upon the crowds. I just want to finish up just mentioning about the Talmidim. And the Talmidim is the Hebrew or the Aramaic term for the disciples. It came out of the Greek mantano, to learn. You know, and we know that Jesus was a rabbi, don't we? You know, but did you know there was two kinds of rabbi? There was the rabbi who was the Torah teacher, and they were permitted to teach the set understandings of what the Torah had already been interpreted and was already understood. But there was another kind of rabbi called the Shmika. And the Shmika rabbi was somebody who could teach new interpretations of the Torah. And if you remember the scripture about Jesus teaching with authority and how they were amazed, it's because he was acting like a Shmika rabbi. He was teaching as somebody who could bring fresh interpretation to the Torah, to the Old Testament. But anytime that you had this kind of rabbi, then people would want to be their disciples, and they would work to try and appeal to this rabbi, to be approved by this rabbi. They would have to be the best in their class to be sought out by the teacher, and they would often ask. But what happened with Jesus? He didn't go after the ones who did best in Torah class after school. He didn't go for the learned. He didn't go for the ones who looked good. He went for the fisherman. He went for the tax collector. He went for the unqualified. He went for the people who would never be chosen by any rabbi to be the disciples. But he believes in each one of us. But what did the disciples do? Well, as these Talmidim, as the disciples, or John Mark Comer would describe it as apprentices, which is a better word in many ways than disciples, because disciples we load already with so many scriptural meanings, whereas apprentices, we know, are people who work alongside a master. And they live like him, and they do everything. Like, genuinely, the Talmidim in New Testament times, they would follow their rabbi into the toilet to see if they did anything special around that time, because they needed to imitate them exactly. And so the question is, this morning, are you a disciple, or are you a part of the crowd? Is your gospel one where you need the approval of the crowd, or where you get lost in the crowd, or where you're just there to be entertained like the crowd? Or are you there because of the kingdom? Are you there because you want that relationship? Are you there because you actually care about the kingdom? And are you intent on living like Jesus lived? We'll finish with these quotes. The kingdom gospel includes a call to self-denial. It's focused on giving ourselves up for the sake of others, rather than on becoming financially prosperous or satisfied religious consumers. C.D. Alexander said, "Conversion without discipleship is openly implied in some of our evangelical teaching. It has become strangely possible to be Christ's without taking up the cross." Jesus spoke to the crowds. He taught the crowds, but he journeyed with his disciples. He walked with the one. He walked with the 3. He walked with the 12. They saw everything that he did and they imitated him. And so my challenge to you today is to be like one of the Talmudim, to be one that doesn't get lost in a crowd, but is focused on Jesus, on following him, and he becomes your reward and not the things that he gives you. And one final challenge with that as well. That's a challenge for you in terms of your relationship with Jesus. But I also want to ask you this. Jesus sent us out there to make disciples. He didn't just send Mary and Phil Buckley or Matt and Becky Hill out there to make disciples. He sent you out to make disciples. And I want to ask, who are you discipling? Who are you journeying with? You can't journey with a crowd, but who are the 3 in your life? Who are the 12 in your life? Who are you journeying with as they also seek to become more like Jesus?